Drive. So you just have to hit the text box in front of you so you can get that off of the screen. I'll be monitoring the chat as well. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll be able to talk about them. I'll do my best to answer them throughout. And if I can't answer them throughout, we will talk afterwards. So this morning's presentation is called Unmasking Racial Injustice, the Black Community's Housing Crisis. And I'll give you a little bit of history. I did this presentation for a homeless organization in LA called PATH, People Assisting the Homeless. And in chatting with folks about some of the historical nuances and racial inequity as it pertains to housing, I thought this would be a great presentation to ground today's training with, because there's always, unfortunately, issues and concerns that are happening as each of you all are doing everything you can to fight the good fight to get families housed. But historically, we may not really understand where this issue comes from. So owning a home is undeniable. It's probably the largest part of generating generational wealth here in American society. And the key to passing down intergenerational wealth is accumulating either land or property that sits on top of the land. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how the Black community has been left out of that. So for those of you that are new, I haven't had the pleasure of meeting absolutely everyone yet. My name is Rhett Burton. I am our Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Belonging here at Compass Family Services. And I'm so excited. For those of you that I know, hi, good morning. For those of you that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, we will, but you'll probably notice me most as the person that sends all those really interesting emails out. So that's how you'll probably get to know my name and face. As with any good presentation, we're going to start off with the circumference of awareness. Everything inside that circle is what you think you know about what you think you know. And with any good training presentation, the goal is to expand your circumference of awareness. So I'm going to share some things with you that you may know. I'm going to share some things with you that may run counter to everything you've been taught or things that you've never been exposed to. And it doesn't mean that the information isn't true. It just means that we need more exposure and greater research. So when we think about this, I want to do with an introduction that this is going to outline the history of racial injustice that has caused the housing crisis. And we're going to provide an in-depth look at some of the disparities between Black and white communities. And I am not going to go as far back as slavery. When looking at sort of the racial injustice as it comes to housing discrimination in the United States, but it is rooted in slavery, segregation, and discrimination, or Jim Crow, that's been perpetuated for centuries. So you may have wondered or thought to yourself, why is it that certain communities are so far behind in certain areas of life here in the States? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I want to ground us with this quote from D.L. Hughley, that the most dangerous place for Black people to live is in white people's imagination. We live in an America right now where we have evolved, but we inherently believe that Black people are criminal. And I just want you to put in the chat, when you read that, this is something from D.L. Hughley's press tour about his book that came out a couple of years ago. But I thought it was extremely fitting for today's presentation when we think about racial discrimination that has occurred systematically and systemically in the housing sector, and even things that we notice now, if you know anything about Ralph Yarn and the issue that him and his family has faced. The most dangerous place for Black people to live is in white people's imagination. In the chat, tell me, how does that make you feel when you see that? I just want you to put it in the chat. How does that make you feel? Do you believe it's true? Not true? Does it resonate? Does it bother you? Does it concern you? Put that in the chat for me, because we're going to come back to that a little later. Sad but true. Thank you, Cece. I want to see more of us engaging in the chat. It concerns me. It bothers me. Feels painful. Feels real. It resonates as true. Absolutely. Sad but true. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Keep that going. So what we're going to do is we are going to take a journey down housing segregation lane. Now, most times when people try to go down memory lane, these are fond memories. These are things that people are excited to think about and to share. But unfortunately, the story of housing discrimination is rooted in a long history of racist government policies. That's what makes it systematic, is the policy, the structure, the government as an entity, ensuring that the Black community is downtrodden. And this doesn't just go for the Black community, this goes for all communities of color, but we're going to talk about systematically what happened with housing segregation in the Black community, because there is such a wide-ranging history and so many facts. Now, see, these policies weren't just perpetuated by the government, it was perpetuated by the real estate industry and private attitudes that began during slavery. If you believe that a population is only 3/5 of a human being, or cattle, which is where they get chattel slavery, because you were property, you were seen as less than, you couldn't possibly believe that in only a few decades or even a century or two that those attitudes would dissipate. The federal government began to push and expand home ownership during the New Deal, with the invention of things like the 30-year mortgage, which is the standard mortgage. I see some people coming into the room, so we're going to keep going, but we're going to do a timeline. So again, we're not going to talk about slavery. We're not going to talk about being enslaved. We're not going to talk about Jim Crow. We're not going to talk about just the South. But when you look at this housing racism timeline, 1917 to 1948, we see racially restrictive covenants. These covenants barred African-American home ownership. Then you go to 1934 to 1968, Federal Housing Authority and redlining. Redlining is that big word. That's what a lot of people are more aware of as a catch-all, as a term, is redlining. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Then we have unenforceable covenants from 1948 to 1968. Then we have 1968 to the present, housing discrimination and local land use regulations. So again, I want to hear from you in the chat. We know that racism exists. We know that there was an enslavement of Black people here, but when you look at the timeline, when we stroll down memory lane, how is this resonating for you when you think about systematically in every era from 1619, and if you do a little more scholarship from 1526, with some of the original indigenous inhabitants of what we know as North America, to present day. And we're not talking about race, we're not talking about segregation, we're not talking about Jim Crow, we're not talking about slavery. We're talking about eras that are really only 50, 60 years ago. Tell me in the chat, how does that make you feel when you look at the timeline? Tell me, how does it make you feel? And you may see the image that Black people, even if they had the means, they had the socioeconomic status, thumbs are up, we're ready to go, still denied. Absolutely, the century of generational wealth loss, absolutely. These practices have been long enforced. Yeah, absolutely. Again, sad but true, horrible. It's exactly how we got to where we are today. Imagine there being a covenant or a policy, protocol, paper that is there that says, you can't own here because you're Black. You can't own here even if you have the economic means, you don't have the racial means to be in this community. And we're only just getting started. So we're going to keep going. We want white tenants in our community. White tenants in our community. These signs could be seen all throughout America, not just in the South. One of the biggest slaveholding states was New York. So not just the South, it was absolutely everywhere. So here's how this goes. And I want you to tell me, when you see the imagery, how does it make you feel inside? With one word, put a feeling in the chat. The vacancies in white projects were created primarily by the Federal Housing Administration program to suburbanize America. You see, we wanted to make sure that we could create a real disparity, not just in wealth or by race, but when we think of status, when we think about the ability to live, we are drawing the lines of where folks can be and where they cannot be. And see, the FHA, what they did is they subsidized the mass production of building units or creating subdivisions that we would know as white-only communities. One thing that I want you to think about, and something that I want you to research, because I know that we have some students here, I want you to Google, and I'm gonna put this in the chat for you because I want you to do this on your own time. A sundown town. We had several of them here in California. Google sundown towns. And I'm going to give you a hint. That means if you're Black, don't be there after the sun goes down. Because these are these white-only communities that the federal government has said, we need to carve this out for this particular community. And they would subsidize not just the communities, but the families who were living in these white-only projects or white-only communities as well, because they wanted to move them elsewhere, move them out of the central cities and to create what we know now as the suburbs. See, everything has been systematic. Everything has been systemic. So it was the Federal Housing Administration that depopulated public housing of white families. While the public housing authorities were charged with the responsibility of creating Black-only communities. So they would move whites out, move them to the suburbs, and then we have to keep a dense population of Black folks in these recently evacuated communities to where they could stay poor and they would stay on what we would consider government assistance. When we think about the racial disparity, African Americans represent 13% or a little more based on most recent data of the population, but account for 39% of people experiencing homelessness and 50+% of homeless families with children. And this is nationwide. This is not just California, but this is absolutely nationwide. Imagine being 13% of anything. Such a minuscule number of the overall population, but being 39% of the people experiencing homelessness, and then 50+% if you have a family. And that resonates deeply with me and deeply with our mission, because we are on a mission to help end family homelessness. All of the images that you'll see are also of folks that were either experiencing homelessness or have come out of homelessness recently. So when you see that, you must think about, well, what are the causes? Because we know that the Federal Housing Administration, the government, real estate developers, there's that white flight, there's also racial attitudes. So when we think about from slavery to segregation, and we're not even touching on that, African Americans have been systematically denied rights and socioeconomic opportunities. Imagine what happens when you have what was perceived to be unskilled labor become the skilled labor during slavery, because African Americans are folks that built the country. Most African Americans helped to build the plantations that their white counterparts would live in, and then they would be forced to plow and to till the field. So you don't have any economic means, so you may have the skilled labor. So to be disproportionately in homelessness as a byproduct of systemic inequity, that's the big cause. You are targeted. We are saying that this community, we are going to make sure that we are ethnically cleansing a community that we don't want, or that we no longer want to have anything to do with. So the lingering effects of racism continue to perpetuate these disparities today in critical areas that impact homelessness rates, and we're going to talk about that. So I want you to keep that in mind when we go through what are the causes, because this is where a lot of people aren't really too sure. So I think that there are a lot of causes, right? But I'm going to narrow these things down to three main causes, because we're not going to talk about slavery. We're not going to talk about segregation. We're not going to talk about Jim Crow. But when we think about poverty and all of these things are interconnected. Poverty, segregation, and rental and housing discrimination, and incarceration, something that is not talked about enough, about what are some of the causes for the Black housing crisis. And we're going to go through each and every one of those. So I wanted to share this chart with you so you could take a look at the ratio proportion in poverty relative to the total population. So you'll see all different types of communities, but when you look here at the Black community, leading in every statistical category. So when you're taking a look at this, from underrepresented in poverty to overrepresented in poverty. So I really want you to look here. Poverty, and particularly deep poverty, these are folks that we would consider destitute. That is a strong predictor of homelessness. And because Black folks were systematically targeted They are they're overrepresented in poverty. They are overrepresented in their overall percentage based on the entire population with 13%. That goes back to that 36 and the 50+% in each category. And we wonder why a certain community is struggling. And here's the thing, it doesn't mean that other communities of color are not struggling, because they very well are. You can look at these numbers here about the overrepresentation in poverty alone, based on the community that you are a part of, but there is a vast overrepresentation of the Black community. This data comes from 2019. And if the share of Black folks in poverty was 1.8, right? We see that 1.8 times greater than their share of the general population. That means that if Black folks are representing 13% or 13.2% of the population, that means 23.8% of the Black community are impoverished. So you have 13% of the population, that pie gets smaller. Then 23% are in poverty, 36% are homeless, and 50+% if you have a family are experiencing family homelessness. That's something that is extremely difficult to come out of. And we think about redlining. This actually was taken from City Hall here in San Francisco. And you look at the date, March 2nd, 1962, not that long ago. Availability of rental vacancies in San Francisco by race. This is the way that we used to do it here in our very liberal city and state. And you think about just the names, the power in a name: Negro, Oriental, white. Keep out. This is the percentage that I really want you to pay attention to. And again, this is done in City Hall, the City Hall that's right down the street. Who's welcome? White people, 100%. Come on in. We got to find a way for you. Keep out? No, we want to keep white folks in. Oriental? Okay. Absolutely bigoted and terrible racist term to consider our Asian American and Pacific Island folks. But okay, we'll accept you. Negro. This is in the 60s. So this is during the Civil Rights Movement. So the terminology is on par with the era in which this information is being presented. We can keep a little of you, but the majority of you want out. And this is where we think about redlining. And I see some folks putting, yeah, it is unfortunate. This is what we think about redlining, right? In redlining, and we'll find the least common denominator is systemic housing discrimination supported by the federal government based on race. And it is a root cause of the current wealth gap between white households and households of color, is redlining. Redlining discouraged economic investment, such as mortgages, business loans, business development in Black and brown communities, because all of that wealth was funneled to white communities as we created this suburbs or the areas of even this city that you can tell there is a certain feeling. There is a white part of town and there are the towns for others. And it's extremely unfortunate, but this is the history that we have. What I want to do is we're going to watch a quick video. Now, hopefully this video doesn't buffer, and I need you to put in the chat, let me know if you can hear, and I hope you can.
What is redlining?
Tell me in the chat.
Redlining is
Can
a
you hear?
discriminatory lending practice denying access to federally backed mortgages and loans to certain communities based on race and ethnicity. It all started in the 1930s. During the housing crisis of the Great Depression, real estate moguls such as Springfield's Harry Kissel laid the groundwork for the National Housing Act of 1934. From this, a new federal agency was formed, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and with it, residential security maps that became the standard to determine the best places for housing investments. White communities with strong
Oh, does it not want us to be great, everyone?
racially restricted deeds were given a grade A rating and identified as desirable for lending purposes, while Black communities, regardless of their economic status, were given a grade D rating and branded as hazardous and high risk. No federally backed loans would be made there. Redlining locked out millions of Americans from accessing mortgages and stunted opportunities for Black families to build wealth to pass down to future generations. Although the practice of redlining was outlawed with the signing of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, the damage was done. Segregation was embedded in our cities and suburbs. Living in segregated communities has modern-day consequences, including sharp disparities in family wealth, education, and life expectancy. These maps were made more than 80 years ago, and yet they still tell a story that impacts us today, the story of redlining.
Thank you all for watching that. So when we think about that, right, a recent study of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, folks we work with on racial discrimination, found that people of color were often shown fewer rental units and denied more leases in comparison to their white counterparts. So as the video said, this was systemic. This was targeted against a particular community. And even when you had the socioeconomic means, meaning you had the money, you had the status, you had the capital, you didn't have the complexion that allowed you to live in a community that your income should have afforded you. So white people, on the other hand, were not just shown better units, they were frequently provided lower rents. So deposits, moving costs, everything associated with creating those white-only communities were considered negotiable based on the color of your skin, making it easier for white communities to secure units. And when you look at that redlining map, if you ever come into my office, there is a map of San Francisco's redlining right behind me, if you ever want to come see about which communities and which areas of the city were considered desirable and which ones were not. So we're going to keep going. Let's go past this. Now, this map, and we're going to look at this a little deeper. This map is in LA. And I want you to look at some of the language used. 1939, infiltrated, blighted, subversive, descriptions of LA neighborhoods highlight racist housing policies. And what winds up happening is when you see these grades that are listed right here, and they are color-coded. So Sunset Boulevard, indications are this area will maintain its charm and popularity for a great many years to come. How many of you all have ever been to Beverly Hills on Sunset Boulevard? It has. Everything that this map said it would do, it's done. Then when you get to Washington, Vermont, subversive racial elements, particularly Negroes increasing, meaning there are more Blacks here, we have to downgrade its status. May become a blighted area. Not as many Blacks here yet, but they're coming. We're going to downgrade its status. Since deed restrictions expired, rapidly become infiltrated with Negroes and Japanese, showing that this is not solely just a Black issue, but this was about all communities of color and protecting white flight. Threat of Negro infiltration from areas to the north. Just look at some of the language and the way that communities were described. So when you look at this map and we're reading it together, Black people were left out systematically through a process known as redlining, which created these labels, this A, this B, this C for home loans, for access to these communities. And the thing that is also really infuriating is that Black folks and other communities of color were relegated to particular areas on these government-sponsored maps. I never want you to forget that these are government-sponsored maps. Not just city, these were backed by the federal government, where poverty was the most concentrated and where housing was deteriorated. So when you think about it, anyone here that's from LA, anyone here that's ever visited, think about the Beverly Hills area and as you come down to Compton. Really, really sad. And when you think about this here, the population is homogeneous or homogeneous. That means that, oh, this isn't too bad. There are mostly whites here. So we have a pretty strict area. It's not an A area because there are some people of color, but it's mostly white. Let's keep going. Now let's talk a little bit about incarceration, because this is something that isn't talked about enough as far as I'm concerned. So the racial disparity in incarceration rates have continued to worsen. If anyone here has ever seen Ava DuVernay's 13, which is a great documentary, it's probably on Netflix or maybe even YouTube now, that talks about the 13th Amendment and the disproportionality of African Americans that are being incarcerated. The rate for African Americans tripled between 1968 and 2016, and is more than 6 times the rate of white incarceration. So again, we're going back and we're looking at these percentages. 13% of the population, but incarcerated at a 6 times higher rate than those that are in the dominant culture. So think about what that does to your opportunity, to your sense of self, for your ability to achieve or to think that housing, which is tied to that American dream, is even possible. And see, these racial disparities are no accident. Black people are at a far greater risk of being targeted, profiled, and arrested for minor offenses in high poverty areas, which relates back to those redlining maps that we saw. It's absolutely devious, but everything that those maps started, everything, the lines that they drew are still prevalent to this day, and you can still feel the effects of what's happened. When we think about the implications of being over-criminalized or over-incarcerated for minor offenses, it's far-reaching, because the amazing folks here that are working with families, you know that a criminal history can keep you from successfully passing background checks to secure housing or employment or other opportunities if you wanted to join the military. People exiting jails and prisons often face significant problems in accessing safe, affordable, and accessible housing where they can help to rebuild their lives after they paid their debt to society. And that rate of homelessness among those that were formerly incarcerated, like we talked about, it tripled between 1968 and 2016. So not only did the amount of people going into jail triple, when they came out, they are now going from being incarcerated to being on the street. Let's keep going. African Americans experience homelessness due to long-standing historical and structural racism. We want to make sure that we are bookending these points, that this is not happenstance. This isn't because people don't try, or they don't want to succeed, or they don't want housing, or they're looking for a handout, or they can't pull themselves up by their bootstraps. You can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps when you don't have boots and you don't have pants. And when you think about what that does to the psyche of the people that are homeless or experiencing homelessness, that plays into the mental health concerns that a lot of these communities see. So we did a timeline, we went down memory lane, but there's so much more. Let's go into the history of racist federal housing policies where we can really see that it's systemic. And when I show you this timeline, I want you to put in the chat, based on the emoji, find an emoji about the way it makes you feel. Look at the emoji and tell me how it makes you feel. We're going back to 1933. And we saw this in the video, right? The Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOPE, created residential security maps, like the map we saw, systematically grading neighborhoods. Let me see it in the chat. How does this make you feel when you see this timeline? 1934, Federal Housing Administration began insuring mortgages, but requiring properties be in white-only neighborhoods. We'll give you a mortgage if you're white. 1938, Federal National Mortgage Association, or what we know as Fannie Mae, FHA guidelines severely limited Black access to mortgage. So only 2% got mortgages. So what they said is, the federal government says, okay, we're racist, but we have to make sure we let a few people slide in. We're racist, but we can't be racist. So we'll let 2% of people actually get loans. 2%. For folks that make up 13% of the population, or 36% of the homeless, and 50+% of the families experiencing homelessness. I want you to think about those numbers. 1944, the GI Bill, the program structure prevented Black people from fully accessing the benefits of the program. Black folks have fought in every single war this country's ever had. So we appreciate you. We're going to call you all sort of racial epithets while you're in the military. We're going to cast you off while you're there, when you actually have to sleep with the captives or those that we are fighting. You can't sleep with us, but you can fight for the country. And when you get back, No, the bill's not for you. It's for them. Levittown, New York, 1947. Anyone here that's from the New York or the East Coast, you may have heard of Levittown, New York. FHA and VA, these are federal entities. Housing initiatives, despite racially restrictive covenants that prevented home sales to non-white people, said, okay, we don't want Japanese folks, we don't want Asian folks, we don't want Indian folks, we absolutely don't want Black folks. So we need to create a white-only community known as Levittown, New York. And again, we're starting in the 1930s. We're not talking about slavery. We're not talking about Jim Crow or segregation. I'd be here for millennia if I broke down the entire breakdown. Let's learn a little bit more about Levittown for those that don't know.
Island to uncover and learn from history that deliberately excluded people of color from the first suburbs.
Restrictions were written into some of the earliest property deeds, and those restrictions still exist today. CBS 2's Carolyn Gussoff has more from Levittown.
Levittown, the nation's first suburb, built for returning soldiers after World War II, but whites only. Buried in the deeds, still the roots of racism.
The tenant agrees not to permit the premises to be used or occupied by any other persons than members of the Caucasian race.
Nassau legislator Carrie A. Szilagyi reading from a 1948 lease. And Levittown wasn't the only place with restrictive covenants dating back to the 1920s. Other places restricted Jews.
It was obvious, it was institutionalized, it was systematic and systemic that a Jewish person would not be able, real estate brokers were involved, they would not show you a house in neighborhoods where you were not welcome.
The Supreme Court declared them unenforceable by 1950, but the language is still engraved in thousands of deeds, unbeknownst to many homeowners.
They have been removed in some places, but they do still linger in others.
Michael Sheridan checked his Levittown deed and asked neighbors to do the same.
A couple of them have said it's on there, which is kind of shocking. I think it's boilerplate language. It's in there, buried pages you're not looking at, you're just signing. It's disgusting. It's important that it's history. We shine light on it, that it doesn't continue to happen.
It's why these lawmakers are proposing the creation of a Nassau County database using volunteers to search deeds and expose them.
To help people understand so that they can take actions to keep recognizing the need to dismantle racist structure.
The Levittown Coalition for Change is taking action.
There is a direct intention behind us growing up with just our own people and no Black or brown people in our neighborhood. And it's important to understand that didn't happen by accident. That happened very, very much on purpose.
Original deeds cannot be changed. Educators hope exposing the extent of them can educate. In Levittown, Long Island, Carolyn Gussoff, CBS 2 News.
So thinking about that story was from 2020. And one thing that I hope you caught at the very end is that even though some of these deeds were written in the 30s and 40s, 40s primarily, the language cannot be changed. Very interesting. Very, very interesting when you think about it. Let's keep going. Why? Because when white supremacy and racism are built into structures or documents that are backed by communities, and we don't even want to get into homeowners associations and the powers that they wield. There's very little that you can do, which is why they have to build a coalition to shine light on deeds that exist that way. But there's nothing you can do to change it. But we're not done. Let's keep going down these racist policies, this federal history. 1949, the American Housing Act of 1949 expanded the government's role in housing, authorized the use of eminent domain. And if anyone does not know what eminent domain means, it means that if the government says we need to take your land, we're going to take it. We will compensate you, maybe at market rate, but we are taking over your land. And can you guess what communities they used eminent domain on most? I'll give you a hint. It rhymes with black. Black, very good. 1956, National Interstate and Defense Highways Act. This accelerated and subsidized subsidization, which means the creation of suburbs. which disproportionately benefited white middle-class families. So when you are looking in your neighborhood, and for those that went on the Black Liberation Walking Tour, we talked about this, where freeways are built straight through communities of color, and you will see folks living under underpasses, under bridges, and you would think to yourself, how is it that a freeway is here when it cuts off a particular community from all of its resources? It's creating food deserts. It's creating degradation. It's creating harm and pain. That was intentional. As we build on this legacy of policies, 1968, the Fair Housing Act, or Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, expanded on previous acts and prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and finance of housing. But this is in the 60s. So we started at 1933, when we really could have started at 1619. And now in the mid-60s, we're getting a little better. The language is in place, but just because the language is there doesn't mean that the practices stop. 2015, Housing and Urban Development, implement affirmatively furthering fair housing in states and towns and public housing authorities so that they did not discriminate. Now we have a greater governing body, and that's great. But there's still issues that happen each and every day. For those of you that are following the news, when we think about home appraisals, there have been countless stories of Black families that have owned homes. They got their homes appraised for significantly less than what it's worth. And then they would have a friend from the white community act as the homeowner, and it would be appraised properly or for even more than what they thought it was worth. So again, even though the government is trying to course correct, it's very difficult to not only change hearts and minds, but to change policies, which is why it's systemic, why it's systematic. It's rooted into the fabric of our culture. Now we're in 2020, 2021, preserving community and neighborhood choice. This is starting to remove requirements to address fair housing in a meaningful way. So what this means is like we're taking an extra step. We know that some of the language is ambiguous. People aren't actually creating fair and affordable housing. So we're going to do what we can to remove that language. But that was 2 years ago where this coalition started. So when we think about the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and this is a big one because this is around the Civil Rights era, it recognized segregationist practices like redlining to be unconstitutional, which is good, but the law only prohibited future formalized discrimination rather than undoing the foundation of the racist landscape it created. So it's saying that, okay, America may have been built on racism, and in every endeavor of life, we search hard enough. Sometimes you don't even have to search that hard and you can find racism. So we're going to undo it. We're not going to undo the structure that it's built upon. So we've built this castle of racism when it comes to our policies and our practices, but we're going to stop doing it from now on. And that began in 1968. Let's keep going. The underwriting manual of the Federal Housing Administration. And here's where I want you to see that this is the systematic part. It is written into the policies, into the practices, into the procedures. I want us to take a look right here at the yellow. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, look at the language. It is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. So when we had land developers, when you had real estate agents, when you had government officials and entities saying, oh, there's nothing we can do, well, that's because they made sure that their hands were tied legislatively and in the way that the policies were written. A change in social or racial occupancy generally contributes to instability and a decline in values. So again, that goes back to what we said, even if you had the economic means, if we have too many Black folks or brown folks that come into this community, even if they have the economic means, their race really does make our community unstable. It creates instability. So it says that incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities. I want you to think about that and tell me how you feel in the chat. Incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities. Tell me in the chat how that makes you feel. And if you've ever been told this history, and if you haven't, I want you to ask yourself why. Tell me how that makes you feel. So when we think about the Interstate Highway Act, that recommended that highways, which are a good thing on their own, you do need highways to get across the country, that would be a great way to separate Black communities from white neighborhoods. So this wasn't just a matter of law, this was a matter of government regulation. That when someone had a racist idea, we could say, let's do it. You know what? We've already created white-only communities. We have systematically harmed these communities of color forever. The Black community has been systematically harmed since some of them were captured when they were here, and then the others were brought here. Let's build a highway. There's so much more racism we can do. Let's build a highway through the communities because they're just not separate enough. So when you think about that government regulation, that it wasn't hidden. This is plain sight. What happens is that it becomes the de facto situation. It becomes the de facto decision-making. Racist, well, hold my beer. I can be even more racist. We separated them by race. We separated by socioeconomic class. We created white-only communities and white-only suburbs. Put a freeway there. Let's make it even more racist. That is the history of the country. That's the systematic and systemic approach. Let's keep going. Federal housing policies created the Depression, or created after the Depression, that's the Great Depression, ensured that African Americans were left out of new suburban communities and pushed them into what we know now as projects or housing projects. So remember, as the country was going through a great deal of war and harm and pain and really destitution for so many communities, we're like, put those Black people in the hood. We moved all the white folks. I'll put the Black folks there and don't put anything else there. Let them fend for themselves. Let them fend for themselves. Now, when we think about the West Coast, right? We think about the West Coast, the best coast. Most people think about Jim Crow and slavery being in the South, which it was, but it was everywhere, including here in California. So the West Coast is often held or believed to be this cultural and political promised land for marginalized groups. And in some instances, it can be. But during the first and second Great Migration, millions of Black Americans moved west to escape the Jim Crow South. And of course, when you move, you are in search of opportunities. So you move, you escape racism. You didn't really escape it, but you moved away from where it was overtly racist. From the South, and you're coming north in support of opportunities and prosperity, things that were never afforded to you there. In part because there's legal and racist policies and practices that were so widespread all across the country that even though you jumped out of the frying pan, you jumped into the fry, or you jumped into the fire, as the old saying goes. But when we think about Los Angeles, and I know some of the folks here are from Los Angeles, one of California's major metropolitan cities, that would become one of the battleground cities or places for hard-fought civil rights victories for African Americans, but it was also where some of the most vicious housing segregation, predatory lending practices and real estate practices, and exploitive policies against Black people have ever been documented. And we're going to talk about a little bit. So now we're thinking about California as a state. While Black Californians are only 5.5% of the state's population, they comprise 1 in 4 unhoused people who made contact with organizations like ours just 2 years ago. To think that you could be 5% of the population in this populated state, but 1 in 4 families, 1 in 4 people that came into contact with organizations like ours. So we've talked about it from the federal level, and now we're getting even into the state level. I want you to tell me, how does that make you feel? When you think about that, we are in this liberal bastion, we're in California, we're in San Francisco. Black people aren't treated like that, but to think 1 in 4. How does that make you feel? Put it in the chat. Tell me how it makes you feel. Because I don't want to just talk about issues. I want to talk about some solutions and things that I think that everybody needs to have. First, we'll talk about some must-haves. Because we want to end on a positive note. We want to end on things that we can do. Disappointed. Yeah, we still have a long way to go. Absolutely. If you've never read The Color of Law, I absolutely recommend that you get it. You can find the audiobook, you can even find it on YouTube. And if I'm not mistaken, Erica, I think you've met Richard Rothstein. And
I have a copy if anyone wants to borrow it.
Yeah, it is the most forceful argument. And I hope you think I did a good job. I do. But this goes into even greater detail on how federal, state, and local governments gave rise and reinforced segregation, housing discrimination, and racist practices. Absolutely something you should read. It's a tough read. It is a long read, but it is extremely worthwhile. Next, let's just say that you don't have the bandwidth to read that book, and I get it. If you have access to Amazon Prime, this may also be on YouTube. Them, which is an anthology series, is absolutely incredible about Black families leaving the South and migrating to California. This actually is based on true stories that took place in Compton. And the visual is extremely, extremely powerful, where this Black family thought they escaped racism in the South, go to an all-white neighborhood, and it puts the visual on what it was like to live there. Reading about it is one thing. Seeing it in action is one of the hardest things that I could watch. It is absolutely worth watching, but it is an extremely hard watch because it's based on true stories. Next, where different groups of people live and the homes in which they live are not simply neutral or random demographic phenomena. They profoundly influence the allocation of rewards in the US. And this quote hit me because it's a fancy way of saying residential segregation was not by accident. But it's beautiful in its language when it thinks about that these aren't neutral or random acts. These are people that are doing everything they can to other communities of color. And I think everyone here believes that housing is a human right. It's not a luxury. This is taken from Skid Row in 2019. And these images persist. And here's the thing. All communities, Black, white, every community, we just want to live, to be able to take care of our families and to live in a world without bias and targeted mistreatment. And it's important that for our organization, our mission, see, when you're here at Compass, you have to understand that you are a part of this living mission where we want to treat everyone with dignity, with respect, with kindness, and with care. Because if you didn't know about the historical inequities, I hope that this sheds light on the way you treat everyone. Because these aren't people that don't want to be there, that don't want to work hard, that don't want to provide better for their families, that don't want to be in a better place. Again, you can't pull yourself up by the bootstraps when you don't have boots. A rising tide doesn't lift all boats when you don't have a boat. And if anyone thinks that you can escape 1619, which we didn't talk about, all the way up through the 60s and really to now, without help, if we were systematically put in this issue, in this situation, we have to be systematically taken out of it. That's why it's incumbent upon us to do our very best each and every day to help. Over the last 15 years, Black homeownership has declined more dramatically than any other racial group or ethnic group in the US. Even though things are getting better, we saw at the very end of the federal racist timeline that things are trying to get better. It started in the 60s, but we are trying to get better. Let's look at Black home ownership. From the 1970s, again, we're only talking about a couple of decades. Black home ownership, right here, increased 1.2%. And I am glad that other communities are doing well. Everyone here should be able to do well. But despite the racist policies that were put in place, and then the new policies that are never meant to tear down the racist one, but to help prevent them, from 1970 to 2019, 1.2%. They've barely risen. With that, we're going to watch one more video.
We typically attribute the decline of Black communities, and you hear this from the Trump administration to a number of elected officials, that the Black communities are caused by Black people. But in reality, the money that people use to uplift themselves are taken from them because of racism. In my research, we looked at home prices in communities where the share of the Black population was 50% or greater versus those where the share of the Black population was 1% or less. And we controlled for all those things people say that reduce housing prices: crime, education, structural characteristics, neighborhood amenities, walkability, and all those fancy Zillow metrics that we talk about. And what we found is astounding, that after controlling for all those variables, homes in Black neighborhoods are priced roughly at 23% less nationally than homes in white neighborhoods. And it's about $48,000 per home. Accumulatively, that's about $156 billion of lost assets. It would have funded 8.8 million four-year degrees, would have replaced the pipes in Flint nearly 3,000 times, nearly double the cost of the opioid crisis. These price differences would have never occurred if these were baked into law, largely because of racist rhetoric and beliefs about Black people. How we value Black things is really a reflection how we value Black people. We devalue school boards. We devalue leadership in municipalities. We devalue homes. And that's what the nature of my research is. It's expressing that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. That if we really want to address inequalities, we should not attack people. We should address the real devaluation of people through policy.
Absolutely. So that's our last video. I want to run through a couple of different things and look at some Black leadership and housing justice, because I don't want everything to be all doom and gloom. So we're going to jump through a couple of different things. I'm going to run through this quickly. One, MLK Jr., we all heard this when Dr. Lerone Martin was our speaker and talked about his fight, that housing was a crucial part of King's vision for economic justice. This is from a march in Chicago. We think about Reverend William Barber, the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, continuing the work of Dr. King. Lisa Rice, leading the National Fair Housing Alliance and their efforts to advance fair housing principles and preserve and broaden fair housing protections and expand equal housing rights for all. Alana McCargo, VP for the Housing Financing Policy Center. So if you aren't familiar with some of these organizations, make sure that you're writing them down. You will see a lot of great information and scholarship about practical tips that can be done on the federal level, on the state level, on the local level, and even on the individual level. Where she leads the development of research and programming and strategy, working with key industries and nonprofits to collaborate data and to share it widely. Bill Bynum, CEO of Hope. He personally has amassed a lot of wealth and has used it to create economic opportunities to help improve the lives of folks in Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee, having generated more than $2.5 billion in financing, trying to undo the harm of when Black folks weren't allowed to have loans. And now that we talked about some people, let's talk about a few solutions. And as the gentleman said in the video, without a massive shift in public policy around housing, we won't make any real gains around some of these most pressing issues in our communities. So things that I want to talk about that I think make a lot of sense: housing justice, sustainable homes, community controlled, affordable homes, fair homes, safe homes for all communities, creating affordable and community controlled social housing. That creates stable housing. It becomes a bedrock for communities. Protecting renters and mortgage holders from displacement. I see Kendra put in the chat about the 2008 housing market crash and what that did. Without some of these protections, predatory behavior continues. I am a reparationist. I believe that the Black community should get reparations for centuries of harm and institutionalized racism, and providing compensatory justice for communities that have suffered so greatly. Decommodifying housing and regulating all industries, so not just Wall Street, but the banking industry, in regulating the real estate industry, regulating those that are developers. In many places across the country, it's virtually impossible for anyone that has average or low wages, or even moderate to medium wages, to ever take on a multinational corporation to achieve their dream of home ownership, which again, we know is directly tied to producing intergenerational wealth. And then ensuring that all homes are healthy and sustainable. We have to make sure that there are policies in place that will maximize the well-being of the people and not just maximize the profits of the developers or the real estate agents or the communities that these people are in, the local and state governments. We have to make sure that we are doing everything we can to provide housing justice and equity to those most harmed. With that, please let's stay connected, everyone. You can always feel free to come see me in my office. I really appreciate your time. I'm going to stop the recording now. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me